It is so frustrating and so demoralizing that there is genuinely amazing scientific literature out there that has been carried out and conducted by some of the brightest and most intellectual climate scientists on the planet, and yet it can be easily disregarded by people who have no formal training or education in this matter. And I'm just so annoyed that we live in a world where people would rather listen to Joe Rogan than actual scientific literature. So Elon Musk was recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, and between them, they managed to do something genuinely quite impressive.
The animals are not going to make any difference to global warming. None.
Zero.
No,
it's
zero.
horseshit.
Suppose zero is nothing.
Now, by this point, we know that both are woefully uninformed and just flat out wrong when it comes to animal farming and veganism. But what's actually impressive is just how much misinformation they were able to produce in only a couple of minutes. However, before we dive any further into this absolutely ridiculous video, I want to tell you now about the partner of today's video, which is Complement, and in particular, their Complement Essential Multivitamin. Complement Essential is a science-backed multivitamin specifically formulated to optimize a plant-based diet. This means that instead of being filled with fillers and nutrients that you don't need, instead Complement Essential is packed with essential nutrients like vitamin B12, vitamin D, DHA, and more. This means that you can look after your own health while also protecting the planet and animals at the same time. Their supplements are third-party tested, and many supplements come in plastic packaging, but not Complement Essential, which comes in biodegradable packaging, and you also get a reusable glass jar with your first order. Complement also has a range of other products including protein powders, creatine, gut nurturing powders, and a daily greens powder, all of which can help you meet your fitness and health goals, all while promoting the positives of a plant-based diet. Complement also donates a plant-based meal to a child in need with every product that is purchased, and even better still, if you use the code ED15, you can get 15% off of their products for yourself. So a huge thank you to Complement for partnering with me on today's video, but now let's check out that clip from Joe and Elon.
People dismiss this whole carnivore diet thing because in our heads, there's a lot of propagandists that put this thing out there that animal agriculture is the #1 contributor to global warming.
Yeah, it's rubbish. It's
bullshit.
not true. Bullshit.
It's hot bullshit.
It doesn't matter.
Not only is it hot bullshit,
Irrelevant.
but the real problem is factory farming. Regenerative farming is carbon neutral if it doesn't sequester carbon.
The animals are not going to make any difference to global warming. None. Zero.
No, it's
zero.
horseshit.
Suppose zero is nothing.
Do you think that that's just propaganda because of people that have a vested interest in like plant-based meat products and things along those lines, green energy?
I think it's part of it. You're generally going to get people pushing to avoid meat. Like some people just, maybe they've got a financial interest. Maybe they're just like vegetarians or vegans or whatever.
Ideological interest.
Ideological reasons. But it's not going to make any difference to global warming or the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Really, if people eat fewer steaks, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. I want to just be super clear about that.
Yeah,
Will not matter. You will not even be able to measure it. Okay, that's how irrelevant it is.
Isn't it funny that that's
unmeasurable?
That's
irrelevant.
a heretic speaking. Like that's crazy talk now. Nowadays, it's like you have to say that we have to eat less meat.
No,
that meat is bad.
We totally eat as much meat as you want. It's not going to make a difference.
Sing it. Tell the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And if somebody says it does make a difference, I'm like, how will you measure it? And if you can't even measure it, then it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Literally, I won't be able to measure it.
Well, there's so much bullshit out there.
I did warn you. I mean, who needs regenerative agriculture? We can just fertilize all of the farmland with the BS that they produce instead. So let's start with the obvious contradiction at play. Elon says that animal farming being bad for the planet is just BS. And Joe says that it's been pushed by propagandists. But Joe also says that factory farming is a problem. But factory farming produces 99% of all the animal products in the US. So factory farming is bad, but animal farming being bad is BS and is just being pushed by propagandists. Plus, it's funny that Elon says that you can't measure the emissions from animal farming, but Joe says that regenerative agriculture is carbon neutral. But how can you measure if a farm is carbon neutral if you can't measure the emissions produced by animal farming? And if animal farming has zero impact, then what's the environmental problem with factory farming? Joe and Elon are actually contradicting one another. They're putting forward different arguments that actually invalidate one another's arguments. Plus, the claim made by most vegans and most importantly by the climate science community is not that animal farming is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. That is just simply a straw man argument. Animal farming is the biggest driver of land use, deforestation, habitat loss, and biodiversity loss, and it is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. However, interestingly, animal farming is the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in places like New Zealand, Ireland, Brazil, and Argentina, and agriculture globally is the number one source of methane, with animal agriculture making up the vast majority of those methane emissions. Methane actually has a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, and what this means is that per equivalent mass, methane actually traps more heat. To put this into perspective, only carbon dioxide has contributed more to global warming than methane. So agriculture is the single biggest source of a greenhouse gas, which has been the second most significant contributor to global warming so far, but animal farming doesn't have any impact. And then Joe shows that he has no idea what he's talking about when it comes to regenerative farming either, because he claims that regenerative agriculture is carbon neutral when it doesn't sequester carbon.
Regenerative farming is carbon neutral if it doesn't sequester carbon.
Look, I get that this stuff is pretty confusing, and I'm not going to chastise someone because they don't necessarily understand it, especially when it's as complex as some of these conversations are. But Joe is spreading this misinformation to millions of people and speaking like he's an authority, or at the very least knowledgeable on this matter, when he clearly is not. Talking about climate science when you don't understand it is like trying to be a comedian when you're not funny. Just don't do it, Joe. And importantly, the science does not show that grazing animals is carbon neutral. In fact, actually extensively reared animals can produce more methane than intensively reared animals. This can be because of their diet and also because they tend to live longer because they don't grow as fast. Now, some of the emissions produced by these animals can be offset if carbon, for example, is sequestered in the soil that they graze on. But this depends on a variety of factors, including the soil itself, the amount of land being grazed on, and the existing carbon levels of the soil. Now, this is especially important because pasturelands and grazed areas of land, well, they're not endless carbon sinks. At a certain point, they reach something called soil carbon equilibrium. This essentially means that the carbon being sequestered is being matched by the carbon being released from the soils. And when that happens, that means that no offsetting is taking place. An extensive and detailed review called Grazed and Confused looked at over 300 sources. It was carried out by an international team of academics and scientists, including those from some of the most highly regarded and respected agricultural institutions in the world. And they analysed the claims made by advocates of regenerative farming. In the conclusion, they stated, at an aggregate level, the emissions generated by these grazing systems still outweigh the removals, and even assuming improvements in productivity, they simply cannot supply us with all the animal protein we currently eat. They are even less able to provide us with the quantities of meat and milk that our growing and increasingly more affluent population apparently wants to consume. Significant expansion in overall numbers would cause catastrophic land use change and other environmental damage. This is especially the case if one adopts a very pure definition of a grazing system, the sort that grazing advocates tend to portray. Now, this is especially important because Joe doesn't just advocate for people to swap the animal products they currently consume from factory farm systems to extensively farmed systems, which in and of itself would cause catastrophic land use change and damage. No, Joe goes a step further because he advocates often for a carnivore diet. He mentions it in that clip, which means that Joe believes that we should be getting even more calories from animal products. So let me put this into perspective. According to the most comprehensive analysis conducted to date exploring farming and the environment, less than 20% of the calories consumed globally are from animal products. This would mean that if we were to eat a carnivore diet, we would need to increase the amount of calories that come from animal products by over 5 times. But already about 36% of the world's total habitable landmass is used for animal farming alone. But it gets even better because this is all based on scaling up our current animal farming system, which is predominantly an intensive farming system. But remember, Joe doesn't want that. No, Joe wants an extensive, regeneratively farmed system where we're all eating regeneratively farmed beef, which by some estimates requires 2.5 times more land than intensively farmed beef. Oh, and also bear in mind that by the year 2050, it's estimated that we could be eating 88% more ruminant meat than we were in 2010. This is because by 2050, there will probably be about another 2 billion people on the planet compared to 2010, and also, as well as that, per capita meat consumption is rising. So not only would we need to almost double the amount of farmland being used for ruminant meat production just to meet that increase, but on top of that, Joe thinks that we should be consuming more calories from red meat, and he also thinks that all of those calories should be coming from extensive so-called regenerative farming systems. Look, it doesn't take a genius to work out that just simply does not work. Why are we reducing the carbon storage potential of land by grazing animals who are net contributors, when instead we can remove animals from those areas of farmland and maximize the carbon storage potential of that land instead, and as a consequence, increase biodiversity? This is just completely nonsensical. And the absolute irony of calling this regenerative farming. The word regenerative means to regenerate, to restore, to replace, to bring back. But if you have to deforest and destroy, if you have to cut down trees and remove habitats and kill biodiversity and increase the rates of species extinction just to create enough land to graze animals, you cannot claim that that's regenerative. That is the opposite of regenerative. So where's all this land coming from then? And for them to sit there and say unironically that the negative information about animal farming is BS and being spread by propagandists. Who are the propagandists in this conversation? The people citing the most comprehensive scientific literature that has been done to date, or the contrarians who think that they're incredibly intelligent because their opinion contradicts the scientific literature? It is so frustrating and so demoralizing that there is genuinely amazing scientific literature out there that has been carried out and conducted by some of the brightest and most intellectual climate scientists on the planet, and yet it can be easily disregarded by people who have no formal training or education in this matter. And I'm just so annoyed that we live in a world where people would rather listen to Joe Rogan than actual scientific literature. Doesn't that just showcase to us perfectly what is wrong with the current information landscape? So let's turn our attention to Elon, because when Elon says that animal farming has zero impact, is he saying that animal farming doesn't cause deforestation and habitat loss? Is he saying that the number one driver of deforestation in South America is not cattle ranching? Is he saying that manure and fertilizers used on farms don't run off and cause nitrogen pollution and eutrophication, or ammonia and air pollution? Is he saying that these animals don't produce methane? Or is he saying that methane has zero climate impact? I mean, we can visually see deforestation. We can visually see manure going into rivers and streams. And even though it may contradict what Elon has to say, we can measure greenhouse gas emissions and we can measure methane. We do. So I'm not really sure what Elon is saying, and I'm especially not sure how he's trying to substantiate what it is that he's saying. Now, it really irks me when people who don't know what they're talking about believe themselves to be more knowledgeable and informed than people who dedicate their entire life's work, education, and careers on these very issues. For example, if you needed open heart surgery performing on you, would you go to a heart surgeon or a UFC commentator? Or if you needed to hire a rocket scientist, would you hire a rocket scientist or would you hire a graphic designer? And guess what? Elon has hired rocket scientists because he needs experts in rocket science for SpaceX. So if you want to build rockets, you turn to rocket scientists. And if you want to learn climate science, you turn to climate scientists. So why then, when it comes to climate science, do people think that they are more knowledgeable than experts who are as dedicated and as knowledgeable about climate science as rocket scientists are about rocket science? Elon is not a climate scientist, and he certainly is not an expert when it comes to animal farming and veganism. I mean, Elon wasn't even one of the original founders of Tesla. He is a businessman who hires experts and scientists. But people think that because he's the face of Tesla, that somehow means that he's an authority in all things science and therefore knows more about climate science than actual climate scientists. And so faced with all of the peer-reviewed evidence, meta-analyses and research being conducted and published by the most highly respected, credible and acclaimed institutions, organizations and academics in the world, how can Joe and Elon rationalize to themselves that all of this mountain of evidence is wrong, but they know what the real truth is?
Do you think that that's just propaganda because of people that have a vested interest in like plant-based meat products and things along those lines, green energy?
I think it's part of it. Yeah, maybe they've got a financial interest. Maybe they're just like vegetarians or vegans or whatever.
Ideological interest.
Ideological reasons.
Yes, that's right. All of the scientific evidence being produced all over the world, well, it's actually just propaganda being spearheaded by plant-based meat companies. What a tired and lazy argument. Because no, of course it's not the meat, dairy and egg industries. Those tiny little innocent industries that have never done any wrong. Of course it's not them. I mean, look, They may be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Look, they may have staggering amounts of political and financial resources at their disposal. Sure, of course they may engage in nefarious and insidious lobbying to our politicians and governments. Sure, but no. It's not the meat, dairy, and egg industries. It's not as if they have a track record of manipulating people, of funding BS science, pseudoscience, and disseminating this disinformation around. It's not as if there is a very clear and obvious trail of breadcrumbs that should lead us to the obvious conclusion that it is the meat, dairy, and egg industries that are the ones with these hidden agendas trying to warp the information landscape, trying to disrupt scientific literature and spread doubt to maintain the status quo. What a crazy idea it would be to come to the conclusion that it's the meat, dairy, and egg industries that we should look on with a skeptical eye. Because on the one hand, well, these plant-based companies, they're doomed to fail, aren't they? Have you seen the stock value for some of these companies? Nobody buys them anymore. They're losing money. They're in a terrible financial situation. Look, they're doomed to fail. But on the other hand, well, these plant-based companies, they are nefarious masterminds. Can't you see that they've orchestrated a global plot to spread propaganda to try and convince us to consume their products? I mean, again, when I said this is a tired and lazy argument, that's because it is so tired and so lazy and requires us to turn off any critical thinking. Are we seriously living in a world where people think that plant-based meat companies have more power than the actual meat industry? And to hear that this supposed misinformation is being spread by people who have ideological motivations is just so ironic and frustrating. And let me say this as a vegan, right? I wish that animal farming wasn't bad for the environment. I wish that it wasn't bad for our health. I wish that it didn't cause antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I wish that it didn't cause the spread of bird flu and swine flu viruses, which could cause the next pandemic. And of course, I wish that the farming of animals was not unethical. Why would I wish for these things to be true? Of course I would rather live in a world where the mainstream, the status quo, the dominant paradigm is the perfect one, is the great one with zero problems. Why would I want to live in a world where the majority of people are engaging in something that is deeply unethical and causes all of these problems? It just makes no sense. So when we think about people who are motivated by an ideological agenda, well, perhaps our attention should be turned to the people who have consumed meat their entire lives, who want to fulfill the status quo and will ignore the consensus of scientific literature because they are so desperate not to change and so desperate just to find a morsel of a rationalization that they can then use to convince themselves that they don't need to change. So to summarize, I'm not vegan because I want animal farming to be bad. I'm vegan because the evidence very clearly shows that it is. So that brings me to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching as always, and as always, do let me know down below in the comments what your thoughts are on anything that Joe and Elon said or anything that I have said. I want to say at the end here, again, a huge thank you to Compliment for partnering with me on today's video, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the next video.